By the end of 1991, Square had their sights firmly set on securing the Western market. Final Fantasy IV, or 2 for Americans, had just been released, as well as the spin-off Game Boy titles Final Fantasy Adventure and the first 3 Saga games, the latter rebranded into the Final Fantasy Legend trilogy. Despite missing out on 2 mainline entries, Final Fantasy had managed to make something of a name for itself in the US, niche as it may have been. In fact, Final Fantasy seemed to be a bit more popular in the US. The English version of FF1 outsold the Japanese, and while each Dragon Quest was outselling Final Fantasy games in Japan, Dragon Quest completely flopped over here. Final Fantasy, for all intents and purposes, had a good reputation among American gamers. But Square decided this wasn't enough, and somehow came to the conclusion that the actual reason the US seemed so disinterested was not because FF1 was released years late and FF2 and 3 were skipped. No, they came to the conclusion that RPGs were just too complicated to appeal to us. On one level, it does kinda make sense. The gaming scene at the time was dominated by platformers and shoot-'em-ups, games that were conceptually much more high-octane and straightforward. But the thing is, RPGs already had a very devoted audience in the West, just not on consoles. The most high-profile RPGs were either tabletop games like D&D, or PC games like Ultima. But Square saw how Dragon Quest, a vastly simplified console take on RPGs, finally managed to crack the Japanese market years earlier, and decided they needed to do the same thing for Westerners. A vastly simplified version of Final Fantasy that could appeal to the casual console crowd. And so, in late 1992 came Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a spin-off title meant to appeal to Americans, developed entirely by Japanese staff members. Designed to combine aspects from all 3 existing branches of the franchise at the time, the mainline titles, Adventure, and Saga, but in a more action-driven and straightforward format to ease up on all the boring, obtuse text and menus that might make it more palatable to general audiences. And due to being shorter and simpler than the typical RPG, it would even be sold at a discounted $40 price point. It would also be the first Final Fantasy game released in the UK, although since Final Fantasy was not an established brand there yet, it would be titled simply Mystic Quest Legend. And Japan would make the game's purpose blatantly clear by calling it Final Fantasy USA. What's more, Square would make a real attempt to improve the game's English script off the back of FF4's stilted display, hiring translator Ted Woolsey to helm the US localization. And as a result, the dialogue actually comes off as very clean and natural, even if Ted evidently forgot how to spell the word attach. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest stars a character who is not given a default name, but the manual calls him Benjamin, and that's as good a name as any, so why not? Shout out to the, I'm assuming, unpaid intern who no doubt picked that name out of a hat and then never thought about it again. Your work has been forever immortalized. Benjamin is tasked with restoring the 4 elemental crystals in order to save his world from the evil Dark King, teaming up with a handful of other characters along the way. In essence, we have the basic premise from FF1, 3, and 4, but this time without any interesting plot twists, enemy motivations, nor character development. It's an elementary school fairy tale version of a Final Fantasy story, stripped of anything with any sort of nuance or meaning, and I have absolutely nothing to say about it. Like other RPGs, players still explore towns and dungeons, but battles are no longer randomly encountered. Much like Final Fantasy Adventure, enemies are visible on the map at all times, although they never move and will only engage with the player when approached. But unlike Final Fantasy Adventure and its Zelda-inspired combat, the battles themselves still take place on their own dedicated screens and play out in turn-based fashion. Your HP is now this Fire Emblem-style health gauge, but you can swap to traditional digits in the options menu if you want. Enemy sprites also change to reflect the amount of damage they've taken. That's cool. Enemies can also be more vulnerable to specific weapon types as well as the expected elemental weaknesses. And so Benjamin can swap between his various weapon types at the press of a button. Magic is split into 3 categories, White, Black, and Wizard, with each category having their own pool of MP charges. The player can have 1 additional party member accompanying them, and which character that is will always be dictated by the story. Party members default to being CPU controlled, but you'll probably want to switch them to manual ASAP, unless you like the idea of them constantly wasting spells and items. Overall, the battles are very much in the same vein as the Saga games of the time, albeit greatly streamlined and with traditional EXP. And in this case, only Benjamin actually gains any levels. Each party member joins you at several levels higher than you, but since they don't gain EXP, Benjamin always catches up before long. Your level also maxes out at 41, which is a weird number, and presumably the only reason it stops there is because that's when your HP maxes out. Okay. Outside of battle, the player is able to jump across single-space gaps or over chests, and each one of the player's available weapons can also interact with the environment in some way. Swords can fit inside narrow gaps to press switches, axes can chop down trees or thick brush, bombs can blow open weak walls or barricades, and claws can be used to climb rough surfaces. The world map has been vastly simplified, with any manual movement and exploration replaced with a grid map, similar to, say, Super Mario Bros. 3, with all the towns, dungeons, etc. placed as waypoints. Random battles are gone, replaced with set battlefield locations that each contain exactly 10 battles that the player can choose to trigger whenever they want, or not at all. And cleaning out a battlefield will reward the player with bonus EXP, gold, or equipment. The world map is split into at least 4 distinct areas, all linked in the center by the Focus Tower, which the player will return to multiple times throughout the story. Every time a crystal is restored, the player is granted a key that allows them to delve deeper into the tower and access new parts of the map. Dungeons are pretty lengthy, but tend to be very simple, with some very rudimentary puzzle solving and a basic boss battle in each. Although in a few instances you'll also need to find an item that allows you to clear fog or reveal invisible enemies. As I mentioned before, this game already has 3 different titles, but if I may suggest a 4th, it would be Fisher-Price's Baby's First RPG. I know I'm definitely not the first person to make that exact joke, but I'm repeating it anyway simply because it's just so apt. This game is so ridiculously bare bones as to completely remove any and all challenge. Basic item chests respawn, new weapons and armor are equipped automatically and cannot be removed or swapped out, and during battle, the player characters will basically always act first each turn, unless the player is severely underleveled, which is only likely if they've been actively avoiding enemies. While weapons such as bombs, arrows, and shuriken use up ammo, the game is incredibly generous about providing more, and even though gold and shops do exist in this game, they barely matter. Inns only cost minor pocket change, and while there are about 3 instances where the game offers a new piece of equipment for a few hundred gold, most of the weapons and armor are either found in chests or granted to the player as part of the story. Money was never an issue for me in this game. There are only 4 consumable item types. In basic FF parlance, these would be potions, remedies, ethers, and phoenix downs. And not only do chests containing said items respawn, but they're always handed out in groups. Basic items in 3s and weapon ammo in 10s. If you take advantage of this, you'll never need to actually buy anything. Seeds, this game's equivalent to ethers, are the rarest, being scarce in chests and only being available for purchase from a few late-game NPCs. But your MP charges are so generous that the only time I would actually run out is when I went out of my way to do so. Saving can also be done at any time outside of battle, and the save menu even has its own dedicated shortcut button. Not that you ever actually need to save, mind you. If you should happen to actually get a game over, the game allows you to retry the battle again and again an infinite number of times. At no point in this game is there ever any actual risk of losing progress. All of this combines into an adventure that lacks any depth or strategy, and that results in a very dull, lifeless experience. The game is never frustrating, but it's also never interesting. No, even worse, it just becomes annoying. One particular dungeon, the Lava Dome, ended up being horribly, unbearably tedious simply due to the large number of enemies and the fact that there was no singularly effective strategy for winning battles quickly. They weren't difficult, mind you, just unbelievably mind-numbingly time-consuming. The game is also pretty short. Getting to the end credits only took me about 10 hours, and my 100% save file, which in this game means maxed out EXP items and gold, only clocked in at around 14 hours. Even in 1991, this was short for an RPG. Now, normally I wouldn't consider a game being short as an inherently bad thing. In fact, in most instances, I prefer my games on the shorter side. No, length isn't the issue, it's a matter of the content. Short games can still be excellent if the actual game is strong enough to keep repeat plays entertaining. That's the philosophy platformers and action games thrive on. Replaying each level means you're getting better each time, and thus learning to play more skillfully, and that is a reward in and of itself. But RPGs thrive on longer playtimes because typically RPGs aren't inherently skill-based. They're strategy-based. They're not about being skilled, they're about being clever. But Mystic Quest has no strategy, and that's by design. The game was made for kindergartners. Not only that, but there's nothing to do in this game aside from the main storyline. 0 side quests. I mean, the battlefields are all optional, but are you really going to call those side quests? The biggest thing that prevents Mystic Quest from being a total botch, thankfully, is the soundtrack. It does make a pretty bad first impression just because the title theme isn't great, but after that, the rest of the music is all pretty good. In fact, it's way better than it has any right to be. I found myself humming along and tapping my foot far more often than I expected to. The battle themes all go really hard, and the town theme is pretty soothing. The soundtrack isn't quite on Uematsu's level, but there's a lot of good here. I'd suggest giving the songs a listen if you can, preferably outside of the game itself. It's not really worth slogging through all the boring combat just for some decent music. The early 90s saw Square constantly trying to crack the Western market, and this wouldn't be the last time, with the most notable other example probably being Secret of Evermore a few years later. But it's frankly astounding that they ever thought this, of all things, was what would finally convince average Americans that RPGs were cool. They wrote a completely milquetoast boilerplate role-playing story and slapped it onto the most brain-dead, most boring, and most baby-easy gameplay I've ever endured. It's almost insulting that they thought we would like this, that this might be some kind of big hit with Westerners. Quite frankly, playing this game, I'm surprised they even assumed Americans were smart enough to read. And whether this was intentional or not, the fact that this is what we ended up getting instead of Final Fantasy V just makes it all the worse, in case you were wondering if there was any injury to go along with the insult. The soundtrack and the game's brisk runtime are its saving graces, and the decent localization shows that Square was at least trying to put their best foot forward, but that still doesn't make the whole package worthwhile. You don't need to make an RPG for literal toddlers in order to appeal to Americans. FF1 sold better numbers in the US than in Japan, and FF4 was critically acclaimed. Clearly, we saw something in this franchise that we liked. It's not our fault that we missed out on 2 of the games. And man, those poor Europeans having this be their first impression of this franchise. If games like Xenogears, Parasite Eve, and especially Final Fantasy VII would teach us anything in the coming years, it's that you don't have to cater specifically to American players to get our attention. All you had to do was make great games and market them well. Mystic Quest is the completely wrong way to go about it, making something completely trite, pointless, and lacking any passion or charm. Mystic Quest goes far beyond just stripping Final Fantasy down to its most basic for the sake of pulling in new players. No, it just completely removes anything and everything that made the franchise stick out to begin with.